Welcome back. In the first video, we motion tracked the live action plate and extracted all this tracking data, but we need to do something with that data. So in this video, we're going to use Blender to set up a 3D recreation of the movement in the scene, of the camera and object motion. So let's get started. You might think that the way to bring something into Blender is to go into File and maybe Open, or maybe Import, or perhaps Link or Append something. But in this case, it's none of those, because what came out of Synthesize is actually a piece of Python script, just some instructions for Blender on how to recreate the scene. So the way we bring that in is we have to go down here into our text editor view, of all things, click Open, go to where we saved that export, track for Blender, click Open Text Block, and here's the actual code to build the 3D scene. We click Run Script down here, and nothing much changed, but our timeline became a little bit longer, and we've got some new items here in the outliner. So let's switch back to the 3D view, and now our default cube is gone, but we've got a whole bunch of other items in the scene. If we pull back, we could see it's a bunch of empties, a bunch of points, which seem to correspond to the points we had in Synthesize. This must be the room, and this cluster here must be the album. And if I zoom far enough, that must be the camera. And down here, we have this big plane. If I hover down in the timeline and press home, it's going to zoom out to show us the entire length of the timeline. And as I scrub, you can see up there the camera is animating, this little cluster that's the album is animating, and the giant plane is also moving around. And what this is, if I select it and I press Alt-Z to switch to the textured view, is our background plate. It's animating and it's moving through space. It's kind of dancing together with the camera in such a way that if I look through the camera view by pressing 0 on the number pad, it's kind of always aligned to be a background image, which is an interesting way to set it up. But this is the wrong footage, because this is the original distorted plate that came out of the camera, and we exported a special undistorted version of the footage, which is what we should be using here. So since we have to replace it, I'd rather replace it and not use this weird moving plane method, because there's an actual feature in Blender. If I press N, down here we can have background images, which are just projected inside of whatever view we want. We don't need to have an actual physical object flying around in space. So to kill two birds with one stone, I will change to the background images feature and change the original distorted plate to the undistorted plate. So if I press Z, that toggles me into wireframe view, and if I press Alt-Z, it shows me this image. So in wireframe view, I'll go into my camera view, go down here, check this background images option, click Add Image, and then click Open. Let's navigate to where we saved that undistorted plate, select the first image, and click Open Image. And there's our background image, but it's not moving around, it's just a still picture, because Blender is not smart enough to know that even though we selected an image with a number after it in a folder full of the same kind of images, it still doesn't know it's an image sequence, so we have to tell it, this is an image sequence. But now it's even worse, it's completely disappeared. Well, that's because even though it knows it's an image sequence now, it doesn't know anything about it. For instance, it thinks it's 0 frames, but we know it's 666 frames. So we tell it that, and finally it seems to work correctly. And it's interesting because now I can, like, what I'm seeing here is the background image that's kind of projected inside the camera. It's actually also by default visible in our orthographic views, but I don't want this to be happening. So I'm just going to check right here, change this from all views to just camera. So we never see that background image in any view other than when we're looking through the camera's lens, because that's where it really matters. If I press Alt-Z now, I still switch back to that 3D plane that's floating in space, and here we see the distorted image, and we can toggle between the distorted and undistorted, which is interesting. You could see interactively just how much distortion a lens adds, and you don't really notice it. But if I zoom in close here onto my teeth, you see there's a slight difference in phase. Let's see if I can notice it. Like here here my teeth are together and here they're kind of apart. So we're not exactly on the same frame, I think. Let's look for some other examples of this. It looks like we're at a slightly different moment in time in our newly imported background sequence. This is one of those classic off by one errors, because some software, when you export an image sequence, it might start with 000, other programs start with 001, and then when you import it into another one, it might misalign by a frame. So we need to manually correct this. Let's try to use this offset option here and just move it back by 1. So now, I think we're now on the exact right frame. I'm going to double check by going to the very first frame of the sequence by pressing Shift left arrow. Looks like this one looks the same. Let's go to the last frame. Looks the same to me. So I think we're good there. So now that we have that in our camera, I can get rid of this thing. Let's go into our outliner and find where it is. Everything in the scene is parented to this synthesize world. Let's unfurl that. Under camera, this plane is parented to the camera because it moves together with it. So here it is. I'm not going to delete it because just in case we might need it, it's animating in a very complicated way. So I'm just going to leave it, but I'm going to make it invisible. I'm going to make sure it's not selectable, and I'm going to exclude it from rendering. So it's as if it doesn't exist at all, but if I do need it later, I can retrieve it. Let's continue cleaning up the scene. We've got all these relationship lines that are showing us what's parented to what, and it's just creating a big mess. So I think I'll just get rid of that by going into this display drop down here and just unchecking relationship lines. So now it's a lot easier to breathe. And now we can see that our grid, the default grid floor, is down here, but our whole scene is much bigger than that. Normally, if you were going to start a new Blender scene and build stuff, you would kind of build it within the confines of this grid. But our scene is very huge, so I think I want to scale it down. Luckily, that's easy, because again, everything is connected to one empty. So if I just select it and press S to scale, I can just scale everything together, including the camera. So if I'm looking through the camera, it looks like nothing is moving except the universe itself is getting bigger, which is exactly what we want. So I'll go into the top view by pressing 7 on the number pad, and then I'll press 5 to turn on perspective so I can see the borders of the grid. And again, I'll press S to scale and just scale it down just enough so that all our little objects are within the grid. So now it's sort of like our entire room fits in this quadrant of the grid floor. And because we took time to orient the scene and synthesize, here we still have this green line is our y-axis and this red line is our x-axis, and our walls theoretically are exactly where these lines occur. So that's very convenient. So lastly, because of all this resizing, our camera ended up very tiny. So I'm just going to go into the camera's options down here, and in the display drop down, I'm going to size it up, maybe like make it like 5. And that doesn't affect anything other than the icon of the camera in the scene. Now it just looks a little bit more realistic, like as big as the camera would be in the physical world. So all our trackers are now much better organized, and it'll be easy to handle the scene and model things, which is what we should do next. We should create kind of a simple proxy geometry to kind of represent the room and the object. Because if we want to do stuff to the environment, it's going to be a lot easier if we have some sort of starting point. So let's try to do that. Right here at the origin point of everything, we have our cursor, and wherever that cursor is where new geometry that we create is going to appear. So I'm going to press Shift S to make sure that cursor is at the center, and then I'll press Shift A, choose Mesh, Plane to create a plane. So it's just a flat little square. Now, I want to align this corner of the square with the origin, so I'm going to press Tab to go into edit mode on the object, and just select this vertex here. And then I'll press Shift S to move the cursor to that selection. And then I'll press Tab to come out of edit mode, and then I'll choose this Set Origin and set it to the 3D cursor. So now the pivot point of the object is on that corner. I'll press Shift S to reset the cursor to center, and then I'll press Alt G to reset the position of this plane, and it snaps with that corner to the origin. So that was just a fancy way to just align it like this. And now I'll go into edit mode again, select this whole thing, and I'll press the period key to change the pivot point to the cursor, which is this option here. And so now I have kind of the beginning of a floor, and I can press S to scale it, to grow it out of that corner. And let's look through the camera now. Maybe let's go to the beginning of the scene where we see the most of the floor. And I'll just press S to scale it out enough to fill the entire shot. Just enough, because anything beyond the shot in this case doesn't matter. So there's our floor, except of course now it's covering up our live action footage. But that's okay, we can just go back into the end panel. Just because our footage is a background image doesn't mean it has to be in the background. We can project it over the front and use this little slider to control how opaque it is, just to kind of see everything at once. So there we go. So there's our floor. I'll subdivide it a few times, just so we have kind of a grid that's easier to look at. And you see the floor is aligned to where the real floor would be. I'll go to the end here and create some walls. Let's grow the walls out of these edge loops here. I've selected them. Now I'm going to press E to extrude and then Z to just keep moving it straight up. I'll push just enough to go past the frame. So there's our walls. I'll press Ctrl R and then scroll my mouse wheel up a few times to create some loop cuts here too, just so we have that whole grid pattern. And there's our room. It lines up fairly well. There's a tiny discrepancy here, and actually, come to think of it, you could kind of see that some of our, let me do this. Let me come out of the, let me get rid of the room. I'll press M to move it to another layer. And let's look through the camera view again. You see that our markers kind of match where the trackers are, but out here to the edge of the frame, there's still a little bit of a misalignment. And that's because I think the distortion of this lens is a little bit more complicated than just simple spherical distortion. There's kind of an anamorphic element to it. And the way we calculated the distortion was a very simple automatic way, but back in SynthEyes, there's much more sophisticated ways to map the distortion exactly to every lens you have, and you can just kind of create a library. But we're doing things in a slightly simple way here, so I just want you to be aware that there's always an even more detailed way to do things right. But for this tutorial, this is fine. Like, this little discrepancy is fine. So we created our room. Now let's create a proxy object for the album. So I'll click on this empty here, which is kind of the master for all these other trackers. That's what moves this whole object. And I'll just park somewhere on a frame and press Shift S to move the cursor to select it again. And then press Shift A to create yet another mesh plane. And before we forget, while it's selected, I'm going to reselect that null again, that empty, and press Ctrl P to parent it to the empty, because it's very important that our newly created plane stays with the moving object. It's hooked up to it, no matter where it's moving. But of course, it's not lined up at all to the real record. So if we look through the camera view and start kind of resizing things and rotating them, you know, we would have a really hard time trying to align this thing. And even if we did it, kind of, we would find that as soon as we move to another frame, it becomes way off. And that's because the first thing we need to do is actually align it to our trackers in 3D space. Then we'll know it's kind of occupying the exact plane that we tracked, and then we can align it to the footage. So let's start with that. I'm going to Alt-R to reset the rotation and Alt-S to reset the scale. Let's see, I'll just kind of rough it in. I'll press R, Z, Z to rotate on the local Z axis. And then whenever I scale this object, I'm going to just go into edit mode and scale it there, because I don't want to actually change the scale of the object here. I want it to always be 1.0. But in edit mode, I can scale the individual components that make up this plane as much as I want. Anyway, how do we align it to these points? I guess we could take it one at a time. Let's focus on this empty here. I'll just move the plane upward by pressing G to move, and then Z twice to move it perpendicular to the plane. And I'll just line it up, and I'll hold shift to line it up exactly on the crosshairs of that empty. So there it is. We know that this point in space is good. I'll select the empty again, and I'll press Shift S, cursor to selected. And since our pivot point is still set to cursor, now if we try to rotate this plane, it'll rotate around this point. So that point is going to stay in place. And now we can line it up with another empty like this one. So I'll select the plane, I'll press R to rotate, but then Y twice to rotate it around its far edge, like a door on a hinge. So I'll just watch this empty and hold shift and line it up exactly like that. So now we know these two are fine. And we can move over to this side and worry about this empty and this empty. Let's look at them both while we rotate R XX on the local x-axis. And you can see that if we line it up with the one that's closest, it's kind of underneath on the far side. And if we line it up with the far side, it's kind of burying the one on the left. So I guess that's because in the real world, the record wasn't really perfectly flat, or maybe our tracking didn't end up absolutely accurate. So I'll park it somewhere halfway in between where it would hit both of these markers. If I have to compromise like this, I'd rather compromise on points that are farther from the camera than these two, which end up, right up against the camera in close-up. I'd rather make sure that this part is aligned well. Okay, so now we know that it's crossing through all of these points correctly, even though it's nowhere near aligned correctly in the footage. But now we can move it in ways that will not knock it out of alignment with those points, but adjust it in our view. So let me show you what I mean. I'm going to press Control, comma, to change our pivot point back to the middle of the object. And I'll just start moving it, but I can only move it in certain ways. I can only rotate it around its local z-axis. So RZZ, I can rotate it like this, and it's not going to knock it out of alignment. And I can move it one local axis at a time. So if I want to move it to the right here, I'm going to press G, XX, center it like this. And then I'm going to press Tab to go into edit mode and scale it down. Let's see, this much. Come out of edit mode, GXX to move sideways, GYY to move down, and just keep lining it up like this on local axes, and keep scaling it down until I very snugly end up on all four sides, exactly where the edges are supposed to be. So let's see. I think I need to rotate it again a little bit. Like that. Looks good. GXX. GYY. That's good. Let's scale it down some more. That looks pretty good. Let's go to a different frame. And you can see that it's now staying pretty snugly in place. That's, I think maybe I might need to move it GZZ, just a little bit down. Just all of it at once. Let's see if that helps. Okay. Looks like it's pretty good. We can keep messing with it to get it absolutely perfect, but I think this is close enough to get most kinds of effects to work. So I'm just going to subdivide this plane as well, just so we can visually see easier this alignment. So you can see it's staying with the album throughout. Now, at the very beginning of the footage, you can see there's a little bit of a problem because as it's leaving the frame, you remember we were doing all that manual tracking, but at a certain point, so many of the trackers are out of shot that it kind of gave up and it couldn't extrapolate the motion anymore. So if we needed this album to come in cleanly into frame, we would need to just finish animating that by hand. And I think we could do that pretty quickly. It's not really part of this tutorial, but let me just do it just for perfection's sake. So just a quick little animation exercise. We're going to go to the frame where it's still, with the last frame where it is aligned. So that would be this frame. And with that album object selected, I'm going to press I to create a keyframe for both location and rotation. So I'll click this. Now I'll go backwards to whichever is going to be the very first frame. So I guess this one. And I'll manually align this whole object to where the album is in this frame. So let's move it one axis at a time so that we don't get lost. So I'll press G, Y, Y to kind of go down, and then rotate on the local Z axis to line it up with this guy here. G, X, X to move sideways. And we can see the album in the photography is much smaller, so I think G, Z, Z. It's actually way down. And now we can keep aligning it. I think I moved a little bit too far down. That looks about right. G, Y, Y. That's good. So now now that I've positioned it perfectly, I'm going to press I again and create another location rotation keyframe. So on this keyframe and on this keyframe, in this space, they're aligned perfectly. But if I go through the frames in between, you can see it goes out of alignment because the animated motion of the object is by default like a soft spline, like it's slowly speeding up, but then it's slowly slowing down again. But in this case, it should just kind of keep going. I mean, it's a little bit too much to explain in terms of animation. It's beyond this tutorial, but let's just fix that really quick by looking at the curves of the animation. I'll just switch this to our graph editor and zoom into these curves. And long story short, all of the last keyframes, I'm going to select them all, and I'm just going to shrink these handles by scaling them on the x-axis to 0 to sort of create like it's like a gentle slope starting from here, but then it becomes a linear motion. So I think that's going to save it. So now it's aligned here at the beginning, and it ends up kind of aligned smoothly going into the rest of the tracking motion. And there's obviously like motion blur there, so if we render this out, we would dial in that motion blur to line up exactly, but right now we're looking at things in a simple way. So let's switch this back to timeline. We fixed that little bit of a problem with the animation. Let's see what else we can do. Let's take our album and move it to the second layer where the room is. In fact, let's take the camera and the light and also move them to the second layer. And let's unhide that background plane that we had hidden. Because all of this stuff that came from SynthEyes, I'd like to select it and move it to this layer underneath. And now I can go back, and all of these items that we actually want to deal with, I'm going to move it back to the default first layer. So, you know, all the tracking data and all the stuff, let's hide this again. It's useful, it's kind of served its purpose, and it's there in case we need to refer back to it, but really now we got our proxy objects, and we have a nice, clean scene that where only the essentials are there. We have the thing representing the room, the thing representing the album, the camera, and whatever lights we're going to set up. Let's just take it a little bit further. Let's pretend we're going to hand this off to like a different artist. Even if that artist is going to be us, we're going to thank ourselves for preparing everything before we get into the complicated stuff. For one thing, we could just organize stuff. Like this room is actually not called a room. It's the plane that we started with originally. So let's rename it room. Let's find where the album is down here, parented to this object. So let's call that album. And let's also give these guys materials. So I'm going to switch at this point to Cycles Render Engine, and I'm going to add a material to the album and just call it album. Just keep things super basic. I'll select the room, give it a material, call that room, and maybe in the viewport, just to keep things visually simple and appealing, I'll kind of make the room kind of red like the real room is, and I'll make the album kind of greenish, earthy color, whatever it is, so we can see things easier. And if we're going to actually use this geometry as real objects at some point, we're going to want to prepare them for texturing, so let's just UV unwrap them. I kind of go into this in more depth in the logo, creating a 3D logo tutorial series, so I'm not going to go too much into what I'm doing, but basically let's create little 2D unwrapped versions of our objects. Let's take the room, let's alt select that corner, press Ctrl E and mark the seam so that it's kind of like a little cut, so that when we select it and press U unwrap, we have kind of unfolded it like a box, and we have a flat version of it here for texturing, if that makes sense. Let's do the same thing to the album, which is very simple. It's just a flat object. U unwrap, and let me just make sure that the right upper corner of what would be the album's upper right corner is the upper right corner in the UV map. Great. So that's all set. Last thing we can do, I suppose, is to kind of approximate the lighting in the scene. Because right now we're not really, if we look in the rendered view, we have that default light sitting out there kind of outside the room. But there's very specific lighting in the scene, and it's not difficult to see what it is because it's like studio lighting. So let's just set it up generally, and then when we're actually doing some kind of effects, we can tweak that and make it look right. So the main thing here, if we look at the real footage, is there's like a strong backlight that's creating this one big shadow from me and the lamp, and whatever other light is in here is very soft. We can basically see no shadows. There's a very faint shadow over here. Let's go with that. Let's take the light that already exists and turn it into that strong backlight. Here's what I'll do, just to keep things manageable. I will select our album. I'll press Shift S, move the cursor there, and then I will select the light, press Shift S, and move the selection to the cursor. So our light is now on the album. And then I will press Alt R to reset its rotation, turn the light into an area light, make it a little bit, make it a square maybe, size it up, and then move it G straight up in the Z axis. GZ. And then I will press period to change the pivot point to where the album is, where the cursor is, so that I can sort of rotate the light around this point of interest. So I'm going to press RXX to move it, to rotate it around the Z axis. So our light keeps pointing at the very important focal point of the entire scene, but I can sort of fling it around the scene. So I really set up the lights in the real room when I filmed this. So I know that this backlight is somewhere like right where the corner is. So from the top, it would literally be like over here, and G, Z, Z, I will like move it out, move it like that. So something like this. Remember, these walls aren't as tall as the real room. We just made them tall enough to be in the frame. But really the light is like way up here. I think that's about where it is. But let's see, we kind of have a really interesting situation here because we can use this album because it's shiny and we actually see the reflection of this light. We can kind of triangulate where our light is because we're recreating real physical geometry. So if everything is working correctly, we should see the same kind of reflection of the light in our 3D album. Let's set that up and see if we can actually get that to work. I will go into the node editor temporarily just so we can make the album look shiny. I'm going to delete this diffuse node and add a glossy node, and that will make the album glossy and shiny. And if I reduce this roughness parameter, it's going to get that hotspot to be the size of the hotspot in the footage. Now if I look through the camera, you see we have like the real highlight. I can adjust the opacity of the photography, and you can see the light is kind of in the right place. It's very close, but now I guess I could just open up another 3D view and change the position of this light as I watch this highlight and try to line it up. So let's rotate it on the local X to move it down, and then rotate it on the Z to line it up this way. And there we go. Look at that. It's more or less in the right place the whole time. Now, we'll adjust the size of the highlight when we actually texture this plane, but that's pretty good. So we've extrapolated the position, the correct position of this backlight, this kicker. Let's rename the lamp kicker. And the rest of the lights are more simple. Let's just kind of analyze what the rest of it looks like. It seems like there's like a strong, soft, very big soft light hitting me from this side, and then just a little bit of fill light coming from this direction. And I know that for a fact because I put up the lights in there. On this side, there's like a Kino flow, a big flat fluorescent light with daylight balanced bulbs, so it's a little bit bluish, and just a simple Fresnel light with diffusion hitting me on this side. So let me just quickly recreate that here by duplicating the kicker light. So Shift D to duplicate, and then I'll just rotate on the Z-axis to bring it over where I think my key light was. I'll call this key light, I guess. Key is fine. Z to move it in on the local Z-axis, because it was kind of closer like this, hanging lower, and maybe a little bit more from the front. And since it was a big Kino flow, I'm going to turn it into a rectangle and just kind of physically approximate its dimensions, something like this. It's like one of those fluorescent panels. Now, to kind of set up the right ratios for the lights, I'm going to go to the World tab and just turn the background completely black so that we eliminate all the ambient light from the scene. And now, again, looking at the shot, the real shot, you see how that kicker, it creates a pretty dark, pretty strong shadow. So here it's very weak, and also it's a little bit soft. So for the kicker, I'm going to make the size of the light a little bit smaller. Like I'll take it all the way almost to 0. And then in order for this to be darker, it means my other light, the only other source of light in the scene right now, the key light, should be a little bit less strong. So I'll take it down, let's take it down to nothing. And that's like a completely opaque, deep shadow. And I'll just bring it up a little so that the shadow is still pretty strong, but I'll just leave a little bit of room for our fill light. So when that's there, the shadow is still going to be pretty deep. So let's now duplicate this light again, Shift D, and rotate on the Z-axis to create that fill light, which ironically is less soft than our key light. I'm going to turn this back into a square and make it smaller, but not too small. And I'll just make it just a little bit less strong, but not much less. Okay, and I'll call this fill. Now our key light, again, is daylight balanced, so I'm just going to make it a little bit blue. A little bit, tiny bit of blue. I want to overdo it. Just a very subtle effect. Okay, and lastly, we made the album completely glossy just to figure out that light position, but now I'll just bring it back to normal in the node editor and add back that diffuse shader, mix them together with a mix shader so that it's an object that has its own color and is also shiny. All right, so we've set up every possible thing we might need to start doing some effects on this whole thing. We have our virtual environment, we have our moving object in the scene, we have our camera motion, and we have our lighting simulating the real photography. So now, in the next video, we're going to go ahead and try to do some visual effects using all this stuff we've built, and then we'll render it out and see how we can composite it all together in After Effects. So see you in the next and final video.